Okay, let's get started again. Alright, so this one I'm going to go out on a limb here and take another one of these older tutorials and see if it works. But this one at least has a solution, and during the break I tried this solution and the solution works, so I think this tutorial is actually going to work as well. The one we're going to do is called Parse HTML, which is very similar to what we tried to do a few minutes with, in the previous tutorial with the text view, but instead we'll just do a web view instead. We'll parse a URL from a internet location, take the text in from an HTTP protocol, parse out the text and put it in GUI components. So this is actually kind of an interesting one, again looking at the concept of separate class processing for separate functionality. So the right underneath the introspection tutorial is the parse HTML tutorial, along with the solution. If you want the solution, then we'll do this one here. And then after lunch, we'll look at databases and preference lists,plists, and things of that nature as well. So this particular tutorial works with a test page, and the test page is at bhacker.com test page. And so during the break, I tried to make sure that the test page still works, and it does. So it's going out, the tutorial goes out to this URL. And so if you want to switch the URL to another text page, you can upload your own text page. What this app is going to do is going to go out to the internet, take this text page, parse out the different sections, and load it up into the app. So it's a great way of getting data into an app, actually. So, all right, so along those lines, let's go ahead and, oops, let me get this back here. Let's go ahead and run through the tutorial. So it's a PDF file. And so here it is here. So let's see. Tutorial is going to have you parse a web page, put the results into a list, and then the HTML page that it's going to parse is going to be at this URL here. I just tested it. It works. The page we just saw it a few minutes ago live has first header, second header, I don't know, some div tabs and stuff like that in there. So let's see what we're going to do here. We're going to start an Xcode project, and let's call it. It's a single view application. Let's call it Parse HTML. Or anything that you want. So let's just go ahead and open up Xcode, create a new app, single view application, hit next, and I'm going to call this one Parse Me or something. Just put parse or something in there. Or call it HTML test or something. I don't know. Call it whatever you want. Hit the next button, and I'm going to save mine to the desktop so I can just throw it away. Once we have that, let's take a look at the instructions here. And this is a good test to see if these instructions are actually going to work. So let's take a look here. Thought I had it open, and I do. Here it is here. So we're going to create a separate class object here. So we're going to go back to the concept of ObjectiveC programming, which is what we're doing in this class actually. Take a class, create a class, and then have the class do our parsing for us. So we're going to create a class object to hold the HTML data. So the name of the class is going to be HTML element. And it will simply be an Objective-C class that's going to come from NSObject. So although we're in an iOS application, we're going to create an object here from NSObject. So in the iOS section, go ahead and get into Coca Touch, go File, New, Objective-C class. And then we're going to inherit from NSObject, because we're not going to get any view components or anything unless we go from NSView or one of the other view controller, but we're not doing that. We're doing it from object. So go ahead and go back into Xcode. And from the menu, I'm going to click on here because I want it to be inside of this directory folder. And go into File, New, and then File. And then make sure you click on the top because we were building an iOS app. So if we weren't, we could do it down here for Coca for OS X. But we want this one here for Coca Touch. And click on Objective-C class, and then click on Next. And looks like person was the last time we used one here. So go ahead and switch it to NSObject, actually. And then the class name is going to be HTML element. So we're going to add a class component. So go ahead and click on Next, and I'm going to go ahead and save it in the current folder. So now I have this class element out here, HTML element, the .h and the .m file, and I'm inheriting from NSObject. This is what we did last time as well. We created new objects. We did a person with employee, I think, at that point. So So kind of reviewing this as well from last time. So we have NSObject. So our new object is going to hold two NS strings. One is going to be for the name of the HTML tag, and the other one's going to be for the value for the tag. So we're going to parse the HTML file that we're going to bring up, and we're going to have a name tag kind of combination here. So open up the .h file and then add, this should say two properties. And the two properties that we're going to add, we're not taking it from a GUI. I'm actually just going to copy and paste this and stick it in to the code. We're going to add to our interface file, we have HTML element.h. I'm going to add in two properties. And the properties I'm going to add in are one for the tag and then the other one's for a value. I'm going to take a string out of this. Why are we doing this? So we can synthesize it. We automatically get our setters and getters. We could just create an NS string tag and NS string value, put it inside of the opening and closing quotes. But if we do a property synthesize with it, we have that automatic behavior that comes out of it. So go ahead and copy and paste and put those two elements at the top. And the only thing that we need to do in terms of the implementation is to synthesize it. So we'll switch over then. So I'm going to copy and paste and stick this one into the .m file. So I'm going back to Xcode. So now in my .h I've synthesized, I've created a property for the tag and for the value. And if I switch over to the .m file, this is in the new class that I added. Underneath the implementation, I'm going to add the synthesize for the tag and for the element. So we just created our setters and getters for our two properties for the tag and the value. So this is all inside of our HTML element. Next, we're going to need to create a parser class. So this tutorial is all about different objects. So we're going to create another object to represent the parser. So we're going to name that one HTML parser. And it should also be a simple class that extends NSObject. So we're going to do the same thing all over again. We're going to go in and create a new object. So the parser object needs to import the HTML object. So we'll include the .h file in terms of the import. So it holds on to the variable. So let's go ahead and create the parser first. So HTML parser. So I'm going to click back up here, and even though it ended up into supporting files, it doesn't really matter where it goes, as long as it's all within the same project. So I'm going to go File, New, File, and again make sure I'm hit up here on Coca Touch, and I've got ObjectiveC class. And this one is going to be called Parser, so I'm actually just going to cut and paste this name here. And also coming from NSObject. It actually doesn't really matter because once you create it, you can change what that comes from because that NSObject is what appears here. The colon NSObject. So you can always just put something else in there if you don't like that. But, so now you see we have an HTML element object and we have an HTML parser object. So let's go back to our instructions. We have to tell one about the other. So we're going to have to import HTML element inside of the HTML parser because one of them is going to be using the other one. So go ahead and put the import in before we forget that. So go ahead and open up HTML parser.h, and then at the top where it says import foundation, well, let's also add the import for HTML elements because one object's going to use the other object. I'm going to create an element inside of the parser. So now we have our two objects in there, and one object is importing the other object interface so we can use it. Now we're going to add the NSXML parser delegate to the interface line to use a protocol. So remember those categories and protocols I talked about last time. I know it was like about a month ago. We did the category tutorial actually as well. I remember that one. That was the category that we did is we actually put in a string reverse, and we did the palindrome kind of exercise, and we created a string reverse, and that was a category that added a class component to the string class. Now protocol is very similar. It adds a rule, and the rule that we're going to add is going to be inside of this NSL parser. So we're going to implement, it's kind of like an interface in Java actually. We're going to implement this protocol. So if we add this here, I'm just going to copy this so I don't have to write it, but in front of the, or at the end I should say, of the @interface HTML parser that is inherited from NSObject, we're going to implement the NSXML parser delegate. So it's a parser functionality that we're going to get automatically. If I add this to the HTML parser line here, I see now I've got the protocol added. So the protocol is an interface that gives us functionality that we're going to implement inside of our class object that's going to do our XML parsing essentially. So just kind of remember that protocol concept with this. That's what we're doing, is we're implementing a protocol. And so we're going to add the 4 properties and the 1 method to the prototype. So this is the prototype that we're going to do here. So what we have then is in another property is going to be our current node context, and then we're going to have another property that's going to be, and now we're looking at this going, well, what in the world is this? This is a mutable string and a mutable array, and then we're going to have our parser element, and then we're going to have our HTML element. So the protocol that we have is a parser that we're going to, it's an XML parser. So we're going to have a key value kind of combination that's going to come out of it. And we're going to use the protocol to automate the functionality for us, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We're just going to use that functionality that we're given. So in order to use it, we have to have some temporary variables to store the data in when we bring it in. So if we just used an NS string, we wouldn't be able to change it. And the NS mutable string creates a more dynamic string that can be changed. So we can change the size of whatever it is we're parsing. And we can have a new object that comes in as a temporary variable. So mutable basically is kind of, well, we have mutable strings in Java too, but mutable concept basically just makes it dynamic versus static. Makes it so it can grow. So go ahead and cut and paste and put in the prototype for the URL string load HTML by URL method that we're going to implement. That's actually in part of the XML protocol that we're implementing. And then put in the 4 variables. So if we do that, then I'm going to just add this into the HTML parser interface. So we have the prototype for the 1 method, and then we have the, let me just make sure I can kind of fix this cut and paste job. Here we have the 4 properties, plus we have the protocol method, the method. So this is in the .h file. This is actually an HTML parser.h. So in HTML parser.h, we're putting in the 4 properties and the 1 method prototype for a URL string, which is step number, I don't know, there's no, it's actually, it looks like step number 5 if you're following along the tutorial. So this is an HTML parser.h. Stop me if I'm going too fast through this. Now we're going to synthesize in the HTML parser.m. And we can actually just put this 1 line in here in HTML parser.m to synthesize the 4 properties that we added. So let's go ahead and do that. So if we switch over to HTML parser.m, in between the @implementation and the @end, paste in the synthesized line. So if I kind of hover this over here, it's going to say the method definition for HTML, load HTML by URLs not found. That's going to be, if I flip back over, that's the method prototype that we put in here. So I still have to implement that method inside of the .m file. So just to review, what I did was created 4 properties and synthesized the 4 properties. So at this point we should have the 4 properties synthesized. And that would be the next step that was here, step number 5. So if you download this PDF file, you can actually just cut and paste the code, stick it in. The next step is going to be implementing the load HTML by URL method. So let's take a look here. In the load HTML by URL, we're going to take an NSURL, which is going to be the string URL that we're going to use to go to that website that we just looked at. And it's going to be a URL with string, which is going to be our URL string that we're going to set in to bhacker.com/HTML test or whatever it was called. And then we're going to allocate a new NSData by going NSData_alloc to allocate it. And then we're going to initialize it with the contents of the URL. So we're going to take the data that comes out of the URL, add it to an NSData object that we're going to create. And then we're going to have an element array, and the element array is going to be our mutable array. So this is the element array property that we created actually up here, element array. And it's going to be initialized as an NS mutable array, alloc init. Remember the alloc and init from last time. And then we're going to be using our parser. Well, we're going to take an NS XML parser alloc. That's going to be the parser that we're going to use from the delegate. Allocate it and then initialize it with the data. So take the data from the URL, load it in to a data object, and then use the parser behavior that we're going to get from the protocol that we're implementing. And then set the parser.delegate to self, which means that that's our data. And then create a new instance of the parser parse, or run the method parse, and then the current HTML element is going to be equal to a new current HTML. So we have an HTML element object. So what we're doing is we're creating instances of objects, allocating objects inside of another object, and taking those objects and taking and creating instances of URLs and instances of NSData, going to the URL, following the object, initializing it with the data from the URL, taking the data and parsing it using the protocol. So it's kind of a mixture of a couple of different techniques of using multiple objects with a protocol to parse the information. So if you follow along with the logic, you'll see it come together in a few minutes. But go ahead and cut and paste and put the load HTML by URL implementation inside of the .m file of the parse HTML. So this is the HTML parser here that implements this method here. So now we have the body of the method implemented in the .m file for the .h file out here. So our implementation of HTML parser is actually complete at this point. And so HTML parser is using this object, the HTML element. If we go back up and refresh our memories on this, it's just a tag value. And the tag value is nothing more than just holding on to the tag value of our HTML element. So our parser here has got our current HTML element, which is our object HTML element. This is why we have to include the import. So this is nothing more than the data object that's storing the tag value combination. So created our own data type, essentially, our own object. We're using our object. So you could have done this. If you were doing this in C++, this could be a structure, or it could be a class as well, actually, class object that represents it. So that's really the interesting part of this tutorial, by the way. So it's the use of the object inside of the object. So now we need to implement the three methods to follow the protocol. So we need to implement the protocol methods that we're using for parseDelegate. So one of them is going to be parser, and the other one is, parser for the parser did start element, did end element, and the third one down here is going to be found character, parser found character. So we could cut and paste this and stick it in the parser. So we need to add these three methods in terms of, we'll just add them right underneath below in terms of the last class that we created here, which is going into the same class. So, yeah?
Protocol equivalent to the implementing interface in Java?
It's the same, yes. It's this, implementing the protocol in Objective-C is equivalent to the Java implements this interface. It's exactly the same thing. If we don't, in fact, if we run it right now, we should get an error message actually, because we're implementing this protocol here, but we're not implementing the methods. So theoretically, I'm trying to generate an error message actually, and it's not going to do it for me. So just like that semicolon earlier, it's just not going to do anything actually, because I don't have the functionality in there yet. But you'd think that it would implement, because we implemented the interface, but we didn't put the bodies of those implemented methods in there, that it would generate an error, but it didn't. So go to Parser, because we have the XML Parser delegate protocol in here. Switch over to htmlparser.m, and let's go ahead and add, I'm going to add it to the bottom here actually, the 3 unimplemented methods that we needed to do for that protocol. So, which is kind of ironic that it didn't give me an error message, but let's just put this in here. This is really the functionality that we're doing to parse out. So let's go take a look here. Make sure I copied it and implement the 3 methods. Here's our quick way of implementing it right here actually. And so we have Parser, which is coming from NSXML Parser, which is the protocol we're implementing. Did start element, so we have the string that we're going to allocate for the element name, and then we're going to have the tag that's going to come from the name. So we have the name attribute, and then we're going to, the current HTML element, which is our other object over here, we're going to allocate a new HTML element for it, and the element's going to hold the tag and the name, the 2 strings, the mutable strings that are inside of it. So we have the name itself, and then we're going to parse it with the element name. Was it a title? Was it an H1? Was it a P? These are the tags that are inside of that HTML file. So if you go look at the body in a text editor of the URL that we're going to go to, and the URL that we're going to is, well, it's actually, I had it uploaded, but I don't have it loaded anymore, but we'll see it in a few minutes. It's going to read the text that comes out of that URL, which is an HTML formatted file. And it's going to take whatever the title is and stick the title in something. And whatever H1 is, whatever P is, and show them individually. And then set the parser found characters and convert the characters and use them as a string. So we're going to put the characters together as a character set, treat it like a string, essentially. So now what we have is the parsing functionality implemented from the protocol, and it's an XML, NSXML parser object. So now we go back to the view controller, and now we add the functionality on the view controller, on the view did load, to go out to that URL that we're going to create and parse whatever we find. So the rest of the work is done in the view controller. So the header, we need to import the HTML parser object. HTML parser is importing HTML element. So add the import for the HTML parser up into the top. So let's see. So we have the view controller, and I'm in viewcontroller.m. Well, that's good. Go into viewcontroller.m. Add the HTML parser.h. I think I want to be in the .m file. No, I want to be in the .h file. So I'm going to actually go back and mix it. You know what? Yeah, it's better to put it in the .h. So I'm going to go into viewcontroller.h, and because we're going to put the function prototypes in the .h and then implement it in the .m. So let's go ahead and put it in here then. So on viewcontroller.h, I added HTML parser.h at the top. And now we're going to make the view controller a subclass of UI table view controller instead of UI view controller. So if we take a look at the UI view controller, the original subclass is the UI view controller. So we're going to make it a table view controller instead. So all we have to essentially do is take this word out, put this word in instead, or add the word table. So UI table view controller. So if I'm over here and I see UI view controller, well, I can just add table view, UI table view controller, because I'm going to have a table view controller instead of a regular view controller. So what does that do? It extends a different class. So it's inherited from a different subclass of view controller, essentially. So we're going to make a property for the instance of the HTML parser. So property HTML parser, or we could call it my HTML parser, or whatever we wanted to. So go ahead and go back into the Xcode here and add a property of the HTML parser that we imported. So we're going to make a property so we can use this object inside as well. And so it's going to be called HTML parser. So go ahead and switch to the .m file and synthesize the parser that we just added. So go ahead and add the line property synthesize. So now we can get the parser, set the parser, in terms of that synthesized behavior. So right underneath at implementation, I'm going to add the synthesize for the HTML parser. And so now all I have to do is set the viewDidLoad method to load the HTML file. So in our viewDidLoad, we're going to alloc a new HTML parser and pass the URL to the HTML page with the load HTML by URL action, a method that we put inside of the HTML parser. So this is the URL. If you want to parse a different page, put a different page in there. We're only parsing out H1, title, and P for paragraph return, or paragraph, new paragraph. So not all the elements are in there. So basically, let me just take this out so I don't have to copy it. Allocate a new HTML parser and then load the HTML by URL with this URL if you want to use the test file. So I'm going to come in here to the viewDidLoad and paste in the HTML parser, and that's going to be an alloc of a new HTML parser, load HTML by URL, and that's going to be this URL here. And I just tested the URL appears to be working. So change the URL around if you want to parse it differently. In fact, we could try it in a few minutes. And set the self-title to HTML elements. So, and the title is actually going to show up in the title field. So add a new method in the table view and set the number of rows in it to use the element array by adding the following. So customizing the number of rows, so we're going to add this method as well to the table view. Because we're implementing a UI table view instead of a table view controller instead of a UI view controller, we have to implement this method as part of the implementation of the UI table view, which is nothing more than setting the rows. So here's the table view. So if we add this here as well, there's another method we have to add as well, but let's just take this one and put this one in. And this is in the view controller. Yes, the viewController.m. Excuse me, I thought I was in the wrong file for a minute there. So we are in viewController.m. So I'm implementing the overrided table view because I'm implementing a UI table view controller. So I'm implementing the table view, so customizing the rows. If you leave it alone, you just get the generic table view, which is not going to have returning the HTML parser element array. So we're going to set the rows for the elements that are going to come back out, that are part of the element array that are going to come out of the parsing that we're going to get. We're going to set the rows to equal that. And then we're going to set another thing here for everything else gets done in the cell for row at index path. So inside of each one of the rows, I'm going to set the format for the cell. So basically you're going to have to put the tag and then the value for the tag inside of each one of the cells. So we set up the current HTML element with the element array, and then we use the labels in the cells. So for the labels inside of the cell, we're going to set it with this. So let's see. So we set the row view, and then we're going to set the cell view inside of the rows. And this is going to be a string that's going to have each one of the UI table view cells, and the table view cells are going to be a combination of the elements. So the HTML element here is going to be for the set the text label to the element tag, followed by the element text, which is going to be the value. So the value, current element value, and current element tag. So I can actually, here, let's just get this to look better formatted. There we go. So configuring the cells to include the tags and the elements for each one of the cells. So we set the table rows, and then we set the cells that are inside of the rows. And the cells inside of the rows. So if you have more elements, and we'll change the URL and you'll see it. You're only going to get the elements that are inside of the page that the URL is pointing to. So this will grow dynamically. So if we set it to a different URL like Google, or as an example, then we'll get more elements that show up. And they'll be populated by the rows. And the rows are going to be set to the count. The count is going to be the number of rows that we're going to get. The count is going to be set from the parsing. So parsing counts how many lines there are in this particular file, or how many elements, tags there are. And then we'll populate the number of cells, and then inside of those cells we'll populate the tag and the value that's associated with it. The last step is to make sure you're using the correct nib file. Well, we actually have this. This is the part that may actually not need to be done anymore. So select the view controller.x by b, and change the class, the third icon, from the left to a UI view to UI table view. Yes, that is actually going to be something we're going to need to do. So go ahead and open up the storyboard. So it used to be called an NIB and nib. It's not called a nib anymore. So the third one over should be the class. Let's just take a look here. We have the identity. So if you click on the nib, if we run it right now, we're extending view. So if we run it, we're not going to see the view. In fact, it's a nice, good experiment to see if it actually does need to be changed in the current version of Xcode, and it probably does. Yeah, it's going to come back with an error message because it's not extending the right class. Actually, it doesn't come back with an error, it just crashes on us. So we have to set the nib correctly. So if we open up the storyboard and we go into, let's take a look here. Let me close out the interface builder. So we have to make sure we have the correct nib type for the project type. So select the view controller.xib. Well, we don't have that anymore. We'll have to do it from the storyboard. View the properties in the attribute inspector. So change the class, which is from the old interface, it was the third icon from the left, from UI view to UI table view. So let's take a look here. So from our properties view, oops. So 1, 2, 3. Well, let's just take a look at here for the view. I'm going to try and change the view. So let's see. I have to thumb through to see where it got moved to. Would be this one. So instead of UI view, we want to change it to UI table view. So let's see. UI, there's alphabetical order, which it is. Here it is, table view. So now don't put anything on, you don't have to drag a table view or anything on here. We're just changing the view component instead of being subclass from view, which is going to be view. Now it's table view. So we should see actually a table view showing up in here, which we do. So that's our table view. Because we are subclassing from table view and UI table view controller. So if we leave it on view, that's just why it bombed out on us and gave us a message because we were on the wrong hierarchy of the view. So now it actually should work. Well, let's just see what happens. It says this is build successful at least. And it does work. Although it will look different from the screenshot, I can show you the 6.0 project. This is the 7.0 project. The 7.0 project, iOS 7 project, is missing the lines from the table view property, just the same way as the buttons look a little bit different. The table view actually changed as well. So we have our title on the top. It says HTML title page. We hard set that by the title, and the view did load. And then I have the first header, second header, third header. If I take a look at this page, actually, let me go back to the code for the UI view controller here. Let me move that out of the way. We're going to this page here. If I take a look at this page, let me bring it up in Firefox. And now I won't have internet access. Let's see what happens. Should have internet access. If I had internet access, it would show here it is. The page looks like this. So in my app that I'm running, just to compare the results, this we set. Remember, we set the HTML page to test page. And then we have, this is the first element, this is the second element. Then we had a paragraph return, and then I had the div tabs. So, and I can see that from the implementation of the code here, where we set the title. Well, okay, so if I change the URL, here's we set the title to the. So if I change the title here to another title, this is where this title tag is actually coming from. We could pull it out of the title actually itself, but we changed the title of the table view to that title. Hello. Oh, it's having problems reloading the URL. The title tag is actually set. If we looked at, let's see if we can view sources. Does anybody remember how to view the source in here? Let's see, view source. There's a control button. There's a hotkey that you can do in Firefox. Does anyone remember on how to view the source? I want to view the source of this page. Is it? Say that one. Right click. Up, view page source. There we go. Okay, here we go. So the title was set. Then the title was set to it. So the title is not showing up, the one that we set the title tag to. So it's overriding our title tag because I changed it actually. So this is the source that it's looking at. So it's finding the H1 tags, it's finding the P tags, and it's finding the div tabs. So if we change the URL actually, which might be interesting, let's just do Google instead. So let's close. I'm going to close the simulator. I'm going to check this one here, and I'm going to change it to Google. And then, actually, I just put Google in here. No, we have to put a table. Let's put index. And then I'll run it from here. We should see the number of elements grows dynamically with the number of elements that are going to be in the tag. But it's only going to find tags that we've identified. And the tags that we identified weren't in the Google page. Or actually, probably have to set a page. Let's just do this one. Let's just do ITU. It's apparently, let's see. You actually have to put an HTML page in there. It won't just take and resolve from the URL. So, and I don't know what Google calls it, probably index or something. We're not going to get it from index here either. It's probably not an HTML page. It's probably a PHP or something. So actually we can do it this way. Let's find an HTML page out there. Let's see. There's no index.html. Well, if you had another HTML page out there or a page out there that you can link to, you could load it with a different and then see how the tags are done. So, I don't know, does anyone know of an HTML page out there they'd like to see? Actually, let's just do it this way. Index.htm. Let's try it. HTML works now. Well, we should get this that comes out though, shouldn't we? Nah. It's not going to come out with a broken message. So anyway, find another HTML page, put it in there, and you can parse that page as well if you wanted to. Anyway, the point was to show you the UI table view controller with the table view, UI table view, and the idea of creating two subclasses or two classes, separate classes, an HTML element class and a parse class, and then using the protocol to put the pieces together. And what you're doing is essentially ObjectiveC programming, because you're creating two objects. The objects are representing, one object is representing the element, the other one is the table view, or excuse me, the HTML parsing component, the element component, taking both components, having them work together on a UI table view. So you're subclassing UI table view instead of UI view controller. So I will leave you with that one. It is not using a web view component, it's using a table view component. We have another one that I'll show you later if I haven't showed you yet, how to actually use a web view. In that particular case, you're just taking a web page and loading it inside of a web view. Totally different concept, not as much work. You just load a view on there. Same thing as the text that we did. All right, so let me stop this one.